Hello, Bravs. This is Indigo by Christine Weston, which I shall read a chapter from because, as the inside of the front cover says, please return this book to Lucille Blenman. Fortunately, Lucy is dead, having passed some 45 years ago, so I figure I'll read her a chapter, maybe two. It was a February afternoon, and they were watering the garden. The smell of water among the flowers reached young Jacques de Saint Remy, where he stood in his bedroom door, lazily allowing himself to be dressed. This was his 14th birthday, and for 14 years this fragrance had come up from the garden into his body, stirring a precious disquiet. Perhaps at the hour of his birth this same fragrance had touched his mother's face and his own. "Lift thy foot," said Hanif sharply. He knelt before Jacques, tying the laces of his white buckskin shoes. "The other one, place it here on my knee." Jacques laid his hand on Hanif's head for support, but he did not take his gaze from the garden, which lay in a haze of sunlit dust, twittering leaves and odors of moisture and flowers. Beyond the boundary of cactus and lantana bushes rose the dark mass of the mango grove, whose limp russet leaves would soon turn a crisp green. Beyond that stretched the fields. The vats and huts and boiler rooms of his mother's factory lay out of sight beyond the trees, but as he listened, Jacques could hear, above the creak of a well wheel, and his voice of the gardener, a distant hum and stir of machinery. "Must you pull all my hair out at once?" inquired Hanif plaintively. Jacques' gaze drifted to the young man who knelt at his feet. Hanif was 20, slender, beautiful in his own way. A velvet cap set off his curled and jet-black hair. He wore a velvet waistcoat over his white kurtha, and his long legs were hidden in immaculate pantaloons. Hanif was a dandy who spent all of his wages on clothes when he did not squander them on luxuries less innocent. An orphan whose parents had died in the last great famine, he came from Manger, where they speak a shriller tongue than up country, but when he sang his voice dropped to a minor key, and he sang a good part of the time. "This cap," murmured Jacques. "It makes 7 at least. There is the red one and the purple one and the gray one," and Hanif replaced the boy's foot on the ground and rose, setting the cap at an angle above his black velvet eyes. "It was bought solely in honor of your birthday. Shall I proceed about my duties looking no better than a shamar, or am I to appear decently clad in your mother's sight? Where's the butterfly you promised me?" Hanif removed the cap and from its perfumed interior plucked a crumpled object which he laid on the dressing table. "That," exclaimed Jacques scornfully. "I chased it until I was exhausted. I ran and I ran. The only time I saw you run was when the buck goat chased you," Hanif retorted, with an unquotable jest on the character of buck goats. Then gravity descended on him once more. "Alas, your hair, my child." Jacques regarded himself in the glass. His own face always interested him, for it appeared always as the face of a stranger. He wondered sometimes what his soul looked like, his soul, that hidden, separate self. He had discussed this question with his friend Hardile, but they never arrived at any satisfactory explanation. "My father," said Hardile, "is not orthodox. He does not believe in the persistence of the soul as Father Sebastian believes, or as Madame Saint Remy believes. My father has made his ideas quite clear to me, and he is happy that I share them. But your family," Jacques had reminded them, "your grandmother and your aunts, aren't they always afraid that if they misbehave, they might be born again as fleas or turtles?" Hardile shrugged scornfully. What can one expect from women? Hardile's heresy did not trouble Jacques very much. Nothing about his friend troubled Jacques, except perhaps an occasional twinge of fear lest something happened to separate them. "Stand still," commanded Hanif. "You cannot appear thus before the photographer." "I don't want to appear before him at all in these disgusting clothes." His bottom itched in the new tight drill. Hanif dipped a comb in a bowl of water and drew it through the boy's light brown hair. Jacques knew that in her own room his sister Giselle was also being tricked out for the occasion. The ayah squatted on her haunches with Giselle crouched on a stool before her, and clawed the girl's golden fleece eliciting screams of wrath. The house was filled with the excitement of a party. Bare feet pattered over the china matting. Bead curtains clashed and tinkled. There was a scurrying between the cookhouse and the back veranda. Jacques heard the familiar sound of Father Sebastian's arrival and saw the priest's fat pony led away to the stables. In a few hours, he thought, this day will have ended like all the days I can remember. When light fades, the crows will fly westward to roost, and the flying foxes will flap across the garden to feed in the tamarinds. From all over the plain, dust will rise into the air, stirred by homeward moving feet. There will be a smell of wood smoke and food cooking, and all the special evening voices. The hour of cow dust, Hard Isle called it. There, exclaimed Hanif, now you are beautiful. Jacques' hair stuck to his head as if it had been varnished. Singing under his breath, Hanif began to set the room in order, shaking the mosquito curtains above the bed, picking up and smoothing the discarded clothes. In an hour, the guest would be here. Mr. Wall, the engineer, Dr. and Mrs. Brown, Hardiel, and the railway inspector's two dull little girls invited because there was no other white children in Amritpur. The inspector's little girls were not wholly white, and neither Jacques nor Giselle liked them. But Madame de Saint-Remy insisted that their company was better than nothing. Perhaps they would all bring presents, though Jacques, brightening, except for Hardiel, he didn't care whether they came or not. Hardisle and Mrs. Littleton, he wandered across the room to examine his collection of butterflies. In their cork-lined case under heavy glass, they looked like a jeweler's window, and for some minutes he stared at the great cat's eye moth which Mrs. Littleton had given him. Hardial and Mrs. Littleton, these were his friends. Why, since he loved them equally, had he not been allowed to invite Mrs. Littleton this afternoon? He knew that his mother disliked her, but his understanding stopped there. It confused him to feel that he must not love Mrs. Littleton. He was not even supposed to be friends with her. She was old and kind and full of marvelous stories. She lived in a fascinating house from which he was allowed, at any time, to take anything he liked. She was the sort of friend one might dream about, and yet. Wheels ground up the long avenue of Shisham, and he saw an Eka jerk to a stop, its dejected pony hanging its head. A shrill duet started up between the driver and his passenger, and Jacques began to laugh. Hanif joined him, and they watched delightfully as Mr. Boudry, the amateur photographer, dismounted from the Eka. In his anxiety to unload the camera and its apparatus safely, he managed to entangle himself in the black cloth. Blind and frustrated, he groped about under it, while the Eka Walla sat callously grinning. Jacques exclaimed, "I hope it all goes to smithereens." Hanif laid his hand on the boy's neck. "No running off, no climbing trees. Come." There you go, Lucille. Oh, my legs. That'll be all. Goodbye.